Chapter 1. A Bad Night in the Timber. Most folks who spend real time in the small towns hugging the Olympic Peninsula will tell you the top of the food chain out there is a bear. Maybe a cougar, if they're feeling fancy. Ask the deputies at the county office. Ask the boys filling up trucks at the Chevron just before the road turns to gravel. You'll get some version of the same answer. A black bear. A grizzly that wandered too far south. A mountain lion to scare the tourists off. Spend long enough out past the maintained trails, past the logging roads where the maps give up and admit they don't know what's out there, and that answer starts feeling thin. The natural order in those mountains has whole floors hiding under the floors most people ever bother to look at. There's a man who has known about those floors for a very long time. The few people who've met him call him Hollis. He lives deep in the timber up in Washington State, in country that stays wet most of the year, where the damp gets right into your joints and refuses to leave. Moss hangs off the old cedars like heavy rags. The fog rolls in slow and swallows everything whole, and things can hide out there for decades without ever being seen by a human eye. Locals have stories. Walk into any diner near the mountain passes and somebody at the counter is always halfway through one. Tracks the size of dinner plates next to a tent. Something heavy pacing around a campsite at 3 in the morning. The park ranger reports never make it onto any website. Experienced outdoorsmen go up to the ridges and turn into a missing persons file by Sunday. The official paperwork blames weather and steep drops. But if you actually look at the inconsistencies, a tracker gone from a closed tent, no prints leaving the site, just a heavy rip in the nylon and a thick, rank smell in the wet air, the official theories start coming apart in your hands. So this is what happened to Hollis out there in the freezing mud late one fall, and what he did with it. The night had been brutally cold. Late November, maybe a few days into December. The temperature had dropped fast after 3 straight days of rain, and the forest floor had turned into a slick, half-frozen sludge that pulled at your boots. Hollis was out far past his usual perimeter. He didn't normally wander that deep into the old growth after dark, but he'd been tracking something, or thought he was, and he kept going. That's when he heard it. It wasn't a normal animal sound, not even the wrong side of normal kind. It was deep and guttural, half a howl and half something rougher, mixed with the heavy, violent thuds of bodies hitting the ground over and over. Some kind of territorial fight. The scale was wrong, though. Way too heavy for wolves, too destructive for bears. Whatever was throwing those bodies around weighed a lot more than the locals like to admit walks around in those woods. Hollis kept low, kept the wind in his face, and worked his way through the brush. When he hit a break in the timber, the fog parted just enough to give him a window. The thing on the losing end of the fight was lying in the mud. Folks have plenty of names for what was lying there. On the cryptid forums, they argue about it for thousands of posts. A werewolf, a starved beast, an old hungry predator from the deepest country. But out there, in that moment, it didn't look like a nightmare. It looked beaten, just absolutely torn up. A heavy, lean shape covered in matted dark fur, ribs showing through the patchy places, an elongated wolf-like head turned sideways in the mud. One long arm bent the wrong way under it. Steam came off its body in slow, weak pulses. It had been on the losing end of a brutal scrap with something else. A pack. Hollis could see the silhouettes through the heavy mist. Massive bipedal shapes circling, shoulders hunched, dark hair on heavy frames, hands hanging long at their sides. Bigfoots. Real ones. Not the shy, lumbering creatures the documentaries pretend exist. These ones moved with coordination. They moved with intent. They had taken the werewolf apart between them like a job they'd practiced before. Anybody with sense would have walked away. You see one monster getting taken apart by a bigger pack of monsters, you let nature sort itself out. You don't put your boot in the door of something like that. Hollis stood there in the wet shadows for a long time anyway. Something about seeing that lean, ragged thing reduced to a wheezing mess on the forest floor bothered him. It felt wasteful. He wasn't sure why. The Bigfoots shifted their formation. They were confident, taking their time, savoring the win. That was their mistake. He stepped out from behind a cedar wider than a vehicle. He didn't have to do much. He just made a presence, moved enough brush, made enough shape against the dark to put a hesitation into them. In country like that, hesitation is everything. While the pack paused, trying to decide if he was a threat or just another meal, he moved in and got hold of the werewolf. He was an old hunter. He wasn't young, and he didn't look like a man who hauled heavy loads for fun. Living rough builds a certain dense, useful strength, though, and dragging that creature was still a nightmare he'd remember the rest of his life. He got his arms hooked under its shoulders. The matted fur was wet and heavy and freezing, and the joints in those long limbs bent in ways that didn't quite track with anything in a biology book. The skin underneath the fur felt like cold leather. He started pulling backward through the frost and the mud. The werewolf was fading fast, putting out low, raspy wheezes between drags. Behind them, the pack was already recovering. Heavy feet hitting wet earth started up again. They were closing the distance, and the timber was thick. Hollis couldn't see them clearly, just those huge shapes weaving through the trees, pacing along, working the flanks. His cabin sat about half a mile from that ridge. That was the only thought left in his head. Get to the steel door. The clearing came up suddenly, the way clearings do when you've stopped believing in them. His cabin sat in the middle of it. Not the kind on a postcard, reinforced, built for being alone for a long time. Heavy walls, fixed shutters, a steel door set into a steel frame. He hauled the werewolf up the wooden steps. It was dead weight by then, those long legs dragging uselessly across the boards. He fumbled with the heavy latch. He could hear the brush parting hard at the edge of the clearing. The pack had decided. He shoved the werewolf inside and threw his weight against the door. It shut just as a heavy impact slammed the outer siding, and the whole cabin shuddered with it. He drove the deadbolts home, 3 thick steel bars sliding into place. Hollis stood there in the dark hallway for a long stretch, leaning against the metal, just trying to breathe. The Bigfoots outside didn't leave. They scratched at the siding, long, heavy gouges digging into the boards, and paced around the perimeter, putting out low rumbles that vibrated through the wall behind his back. They knew what was inside. After about 20 minutes, the scratching stopped. The silence that came after was somehow worse. He turned on the low battery-powered lights in the main room. The werewolf was laid out on the floorboards near the wood stove. Even half dead, it was a hard thing to look at. A long, lean body, matted dark fur soaked through, thin limbs that bent oddly. The proportions felt wrong, in a way you couldn't quite point at. He stood over it for a long minute. He should have ended it right there. That would have been the sensible move. Drag the body back out at first light, never tell anybody. He didn't. Chapter 2. The House Guest. Hollis went over to his medical supplies instead. He brought out the heavy suturing kits he kept for hunting accidents, the bandages, the strong antiseptics. He spent the next several hours kneeling next to a creature most people don't even believe exists, closing the worst of the wounds, working slow, knowing one swipe of those long claws would be the end of him. The werewolf didn't fight back. It just lay there and let him work. While he was pulling a heavy, curved needle through a torn place in its shoulder, he thought about the arguments people have on cryptid forums about what these things actually are. Some say they're spirits. Some say they're a curse. Some swear they're an evolved offshoot of Bigfoot. Up close, under the harsh light of his lantern, Hollis could tell they were all wrong. The muscle was dense, like twisted steel cable woven into the frame. The bone underneath was heavy, built to take impacts that would shatter most living things. There was nothing supernatural about it. It was biological. A predator that had been fine-tuned over a very long time for starvation and cold. How many people had this thing taken over the years, he wondered. And here he was, patching it up. Reconsidering, halfway through a stitch, what made a thing a monster in the first place. It was losing fluids and fading the same way anything else does. That had to count for something. Its eyes, those dark, hollow ones, flickered open at one point and watched him work. There was a cold intelligence in there. The werewolf knew Hollis wasn't hurting it. It seemed to understand he had pulled it out of the jaws of something worse. Over the weeks that followed, Hollis became something close to a caretaker, a host to a living nightmare. The Bigfoots eventually pulled back from the porch, or at least stopped pacing it. But he knew they were still out there in the deep timber, holding the grudge. Inside the cabin, a strange routine settled in. The werewolf needed nourishment to heal. That coiled muscle wanted serious fuel to rebuild itself. Hollis kept a large walk-in deep freezer down in the cabin. He didn't drive into town and load up groceries at any Walmart parking lot like normal folks. He sourced his own food. So every evening he went down, pulled out thick, heavy cuts of dark red meat, let them thaw a little near the stove, and tossed them over to the reinforced corner where the creature rested. He had to be careful with portions at first. He didn't know how the werewolf's gut would handle real food after being so close to gone. He'd read old wilderness case studies about apex predators dropping into shock if they ate too much after starvation. So he paced it. Smaller cuts at first, building up. The werewolf would take the meat from the floor, put its long head down to it, sniff once, and then it was gone in seconds. Hollis watched its eyes during those feedings. They weren't mindless. Calculation lived in them. The thing was evaluating him, working out his angle. Why was the human handing over his own resources? In the wild, animals don't help each other unless there's a payoff somewhere down the line. So what was the payoff supposed to be here? The werewolf didn't know what kind of animal the meat had come off of, and it didn't seem to care. It just ate. It tore through every cut with frightening efficiency. Day by day, Hollis watched it recover. The thick scars knitted together. The lean strength came back into those long limbs. The matted fur dried out, lifted, started moving the way fur should. The evenings out in that country are long. When you live cut off from the rest of the world, the quiet starts pressing on you after a while. Hollis found himself talking to it. He'd sit in his old armchair near the wood stove, the fire pushing back hard against the damp chill outside, and he'd just talk. An old man in a flannel shirt explaining the world to an audience that was, technically, an apex predator from the deepest folklore. He talked to the werewolf about the food chain, about the blind illusions of regular people. "Think about it," he'd say, tossing another piece of cedar into the fire. "People think they're the top of the order. They drive on paved rural highways, they buy their food in plastic, and they figure they can't be touched. They look at a forest, and they see scenery." The creature would sit there in the shadows, those long fingers resting quiet on the floorboards. It was an excellent listener. "They don't know the rules out here," Hollis would go on, leaning forward, hands working slow together between his knees. "They don't understand the order out past those last logging roads is brutal. You're hunter or you're prey. There's no third option." The werewolf, as far as Hollis could tell, viewed him as some kind of eccentric old man, a weird, harmless human who had crossed some line and pulled a monster out of the mud. It felt safe in the cabin, protected from its enemies. He gave it food and warmth and a wall against the pack outside. He was the strange benefactor. Sometimes he'd sit there and watch the firelight move across that lean fur and start half arguing with himself. Maybe it isn't pure evil, he'd think. Maybe it's just a survivor. Just another thing trying to make winter. Then it would turn its head, and the light would catch the dark hollows where its eyes lived, and he'd remember he was projecting. The thing would happily turn on him the day the freezer went dry. The tension was always there. You don't keep something like that as a house guest without a low, constant hum of unease. Every time Hollis went down to the deep freeze, he noticed his stock of dark red meat sliding down faster than he liked. The werewolf's appetite was huge and growing every single day. At night, when the wind dropped and the fog settled thick over the trees, he could still hear them out there. The Bigfoots. The pack. Long, low calls rolling down off the distant ridges. They hadn't forgotten the scent of what he stole from them. One evening he watched the werewolf flex its hands, the heavy, dark claws fully extending and pulling back in. It was almost back to full operating strength. Looking at it across the room, Hollis knew the dynamic in that small cabin would have to shift soon. Something had to give. You can't keep a lid on the wild forever. By the third week, the werewolf was fully healed. By fully, what he meant when he thought back on it later was that the change in physical presence was hard to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it happen. It wasn't the broken, wheezing thing he'd pulled out of the freezing mud. The dark, heavy meat from the freezer had done its job, maybe a little too well. The frame was thick and coiled tight under that fur. Sharing a small space with a large, dangerous animal does something to the air pressure of a room. Even at a zoo, behind a fence, you feel the weight of it. The potential energy in the body. Having that thing loose in the cabin made the rooms feel smaller. It started pacing. Not frantically, with a slow, steady rhythm. From the reinforced window over to the steel door, those long, lean limbs moving with a smooth, awful grace. It was testing the perimeter, reading the walls, working out the structural reality of where it lived now. Hollis would sit in his armchair by the cold wood stove and watch it. Sometimes he'd half doubt the whole thing. He'd brought a real apex predator into his living room. A creature local stories said could clear a campsite in under a minute and leave nothing behind. He wasn't always sure what he'd been thinking. Was it arrogance? Did he really think he had tamed a legend by tossing it raw cuts? Then he'd watch the way it watched him. It never showed aggression toward him, never bared its teeth, never postured. It treated him with a strange, cautious respect. He was the old man who provided safety. He was the one who stood between it and the pack. Out at night, the Bigfoots were still up there on the ridges, voices rolling on the damp wind. The werewolf knew it, so it stayed inside, and it kept eating. That was the problem. The supply lines were starting to fail. Maintaining the caloric load of an old forest predator pulls a lot of resources out of any system. The deep freeze was getting low. Hollis was reaching for the bottom racks now, the cuts he'd put in years back when stocks were heavy. It was hard to put words to the dynamic that had built between them. It wasn't a pet, not anywhere close. It was a guest.
a heavily armed, lethal guest. And as the days dragged on, he could tell the werewolf was getting curious. It had watched his routine. It knew that every evening he went to the back of the cabin, opened a heavy floor hatch, and disappeared into the cellar, only to come back with fresh, rich meat. It was working out where the miracle of its recovery was actually coming from. One evening, he caught it staring at the floorboards, just standing there, perfectly still, those hollow eyes fixed on the seams in the wood where the hatch was hidden under a heavy rug. It was putting the pieces together. It was a problem solver. It was probably wondering what kind of livestock an isolated old hunter kept buried under the frost line. Hollis sat there looking at it, and he made up his mind. They had hit a plateau. The healing experiment was over. Now it was time to show the werewolf the actual shape of its situation. Time to pull back the curtain on the natural order it thought it understood. "You want to see?" he asked the room. The werewolf slowly turned its head. It didn't speak English, not really, but it understood intent. It had picked up on the shift in his voice.
Chapter 3. The Floor Hatch. Hollis stood up from the chair and walked to the back of the room. He kicked the heavy rug aside and exposed the thick steel hatch set into the floor. A serious piece of hardware. Most folks out in those rural areas have a root cellar or a storm shelter with a plywood door. This wasn't that. This was heavy industrial plate, secured with thick sliding bolts. He drew the bolts back. The metal grinding on metal sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. He grabbed the recessed handle and pulled. It took some work. The weight on that hatch was something else. But he hoisted it open and leaned it back against the wall. A draft of cold, heavy air rolled up out of the dark square in the floor. It didn't smell like a normal basement. No wet earth, no old cardboard. It smelled like raw adrenaline and rust and something deep and animal, like a den. He looked at the werewolf. He didn't say anything else. He just gestured down the dark stairwell, then turned and started descending. A soft shuffle came from behind him. The creature was hesitating. That actually surprised him a little. He'd always assumed these things were fearless. Watching it pause at the top of the stairs and lean over to look down into the unnatural dark, he had to revise that. It had survival instinct. It sensed that whatever was below was outside its control. Curiosity won out anyway, or maybe it was the trust that had built between them over those long, quiet weeks. A heavy, muffled thump came from behind him as one of the werewolf's long feet hit the first steel step. The descent was slow. The stairwell was narrow, built for a normal human frame. The werewolf had to fold itself down, hunching its lean shoulders, bending those long limbs just to fit through. It moved in near total silence, which is a deeply unsettling thing to watch up close. Something that big shouldn't be able to come down a flight of stairs without making a sound. The air grew heavier on the way down. The temperature dropped. Not the natural chill of the forest, but the stagnant, heavy cold of deep concrete. When his boots hit the bottom landing, Hollis reached out and threw the heavy breaker on the wall. The industrial fluorescent strips overhead buzzed to life and put a harsh, pale light over the whole room. He stepped aside. He let the creature reach the bottom of the stairs and stand at its full, terrifying height. It slowly straightened up. head almost brushing the low concrete ceiling, and looked around the room. It wasn't a storage space. It was a fortified holding facility. The walls were thick poured concrete, no windows. Lining the far side of the room, bolted directly into the foundation, were rows of heavy, reinforced steel cages. The bars were thick gauge, welded by someone who understood that whatever went inside was going to try very hard to come back out. The werewolf's eyes tracked across the room, past the heavy butcher blocks, past the deep freezers, and finally landed on the cages. That's when it froze, completely. Every muscle in that lean frame tightened all at once, like a spring being wound. The long claws slid out of its fingertips and locked into place, because the cages weren't empty. Inside those steel pens, pacing slow under the harsh light, were the massive, hulking shapes that had nearly finished off the werewolf out there in the freezing mud a month earlier. The Bigfoots. The pack. Hollis had several of them locked up down there. Huge, heavy-shouldered nightmares of the deep timber. The things that kept the local hikers out of the backcountry. The ones that turned experienced hunters around mid-trail and sent them back to town early. No story to tell anyone they trusted. He watched the werewolf process the information. It looked at the Bigfoots, then it looked over at the deep freezers where he kept the food. The realization rolled through it all at once. It understood what it had been eating. It understood that the rich, dark meat that had knit its body back together and put the strength back into its limbs hadn't been deer, hadn't been bear. He had been systematically feeding this old forest predator the harvested flesh of its absolute worst enemies. The shock changed shape in the werewolf's body, replaced almost instantly by territorial aggression. This was the chance. It dropped into a low, predatory crouch, eyes locked on the cages. A low, vibrating hiss came out of it that seemed to rattle the concrete walls. It was bracing for a brutal scrap. It expected the Bigfoots to throw themselves against the steel mesh, bare their teeth, try to come through the bars. It was ready for the chaos of a confined, desperate fight. Nothing happened. That moment was the one that altered the whole picture for the werewolf. Forever. The Bigfoots didn't react to it. These were massive, fiercely territorial things. They should have lost their minds at the scent and sight of their old rival standing in front of them. They should have been trying to bend the bars to get to it. Instead, when the harsh lights had come on, the Bigfoots had retreated. They were backed into the deepest, darkest corners of their individual cages. Those huge, muscular bodies were curled up on themselves, trembling hard. Hollis could see the shaking from where he stood, awful, uncontrollable tremors running through those heavy frames. They weren't baring their teeth. They weren't growling. They were putting out high-pitched, miserable whines from the back of the throat. They had essentially collapsed, pressing the heavy bulk of their faces and bellies flat against the cold concrete, trying to make themselves smaller than they were. It was a display of complete unquestioning submission, absolute paralyzing terror. The werewolf stayed in its crouch for a long beat, confused. It tracked the pack's behavior. It noticed the Bigfoots weren't even looking at it. They had their eyes pointed down at the floor, terrified to make eye contact with anything in the room. Slowly, the werewolf broke its gaze from the cages. It turned its head. The joints in its neck moved with a stiff, cautious precision. It looked past the butcher tables, past the deep freezers. It looked at Hollis. Just an old man in a flannel shirt, standing calm by the light switch with his hands in his pockets. He didn't move. He just looked back at it. He could see the intelligence behind those hollow eyes working through the scene. The undisputed terrors of the deep woods were locked in cages, broken and submissive, providing a steady food source for a human. And the Bigfoots weren't showing submission to the werewolf. They were showing submission to the person who fed them. You could almost watch the second the predatory confidence drained out of the werewolf. The tension in its limbs didn't disappear. It changed. It shifted from the tension of an attack about to happen into the heavy, suffocating tension of profound dread. The order in this room was not what it had assumed. The natural law it had known for centuries didn't apply down in this concrete. The old man wasn't a harmless eccentric who got lucky in the woods. The werewolf took a slow, careful half-step backward, putting a fraction more distance between them. It didn't take its eyes off Hollis. It couldn't. In the heavy silence of that underground room, the creature understood it had absolutely no idea what it was locked in a basement with. Hollis watched the realization wash over it. That's a very particular kind of fear. When something has spent centuries at the absolute top of its world, it doesn't even have the wiring for submission. It has never had to look at another living thing and calculate its own inferiority. Right then, under those harsh lights, it was calculating. It was looking at this average-sized, unremarkable human standing by the stairs and trying to reconcile that picture with the absolute unfiltered terror coming off the Bigfoots in the cages. The confusion was tearing it apart. It looked back at the Bigfoots, then back at Hollis, and he could see it half revising its conclusions in real time. He'd always assumed forest things like this werewolf operated on pure instinct, but this was pure, terrified logic moving across its face. It knew the meat it had been eating came from the pack. It knew the pack was broken. It knew Hollis was the one holding the keys. That was when he decided to drop the act. The experiment was over. The hospitality phase had reached its natural end. It's hard to describe the mechanics of what came next, especially for anyone who hasn't seen the actual reality of what hides in the deep timber. People online theorize about shapeshifters. They argue about supernatural curses and ancient magic. It isn't magic. It's biology. Highly advanced, frighteningly efficient biology. The human shape Hollis wore, the old hunter in the flannel shirt, the quiet man who minded his own business, was just a shell, a highly compressed disguise. Standing there on the concrete, he let it loosen. He didn't rush it. He just let his physical structure ease up. The werewolf took another frantic step back. Its lean back hit the heavy metal of the butcher table. It couldn't look away. The form began to expand quickly, tearing through the limits of that thin human silhouette. The height came first, the spine elongating and pushing his mass upward until his head scraped the low concrete ceiling. The reinforced joists overhead actually groaned as the pressure shifted. The werewolf put out a hollow, vibrating wheeze that was supposed to be a defensive roar and came out as panic. It raised the long claws, but the posture was completely defensive. Bracing for an impact it already knew it couldn't survive. His jaw unhinged, shifting forward and dropping open to reveal rows of massive serrated teeth. Not human teeth. Something much older, heavier. The kind of jaws that belonged to the deep ocean 100 million years ago. Designed for immediate, complete destruction. The werewolf finally broke and tried to bolt. It lunged for the narrow stairwell, a desperate, frantic scramble for the surface. It didn't make it past the first step. There was no drawn-out fight, no epic battle for survival. The gap in power between them was simply too big. The shape Hollis had become overtook the creature entirely, brought heavy weight down, cut off the escape, and in 2 overwhelming strikes, the encounter was finalized. Over in seconds. The legendary terror of the backcountry, the thing local hunters whisper about around campfires, was completely neutralized. Swallowed. Consumed. the rich diet of Bigfoot meat had done exactly what he needed it to do. It made for a spectacular delicacy, perfectly prepared. When it was done, the basement fell quiet again, just the low, steady hum of the deep freezers against the far wall. He took a moment. He let the heavy, dark energy of the meal settle in. Then he started pulling everything back. The huge limbs, the towering height, the heavy jaws. He compressed it all down, folded the nightmare back away, until he was an old man again. He stood there in his heavy boots, breathing in the cold air. He wiped his mouth with the back of one hand. He felt grounded, satisfied. He turned his attention to the cages. The massive Bigfoots hadn't moved. If anything, they had pressed themselves harder into the concrete, trying to merge with the floor drains. They had watched the entire removal of their old rival, and it had only deepened the dread. He walked over to the nearest cage, his boots scuffed soft against the floor. He stopped in front of the heavy steel mesh and just looked down at the alpha of the pack. A massive specimen, easily the size of a small vehicle, covered in thick, coarse hair. Right then, it wouldn't even raise its head. It just lay there trembling, putting out a soft, pathetic sound from the back of the throat. "Hey," he said. His voice was calm, conversational. The Bigfoot flinched as if he'd struck it. He reached out and grabbed the heavy iron latch on the cage door. He drew the bolt back. The metal scraped, and the door swung outward, hanging wide open. The creature didn't immediately bolt. It didn't even look at the open door at first. It just kept staring at his boots, certain this was some kind of test. "Listen to me," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You see what just happened in here? You understand the arrangement now." He pointed a thumb back over his shoulder, toward the empty floor where the werewolf had been standing only minutes earlier. "That was good," he told the trembling pack leader. "That was real good. So here's the deal." He stepped back. He gave the creature a clear path to the stairwell. "You and your pack," he said, "you get to leave tonight. You get to go back up into the timber, back into the fog. But you work for me now. You understand? You're going to walk every ridge, every dark draw, every old logging road in this territory. And when you find another one of those things," he gestured back to the empty floor, "you don't tear it apart. You wear it down. You corner it, and you push it right to my front porch." The big Bigfoot slowly raised its head. The pale eyes finally met his for a fraction of a second. It understood. These things were intelligent. It knew what he was asking of it. "Bring me another delicacy," he said. He let his voice drop just a little. Let a thin sliver of the monster bleed back into the tone. "Bring me another, and you keep breathing the cold air. Fail, or try to leave my territory, and you end up in the deep freeze." He stepped fully aside. "Go." The alpha didn't need to be told a third time. It scrambled to its feet, the heavy hands slipping on the smooth concrete, and shot out of the cage. It kept its body as far from him as the room would allow. It launched itself up the narrow stairwell. He heard the heavy thud of feet crossing the cabin floor above, then the front door bursting open and the creature disappearing into the night. He moved down the line and opened the rest of the cages. One by one, the terrified shapes bolted for the surface, eager to get back into the freezing mud, eager to start hunting for him. He stood alone in the basement after, listening to the quiet come back. He walked over to the deep freezer, lifted the heavy lid, and looked inside. Mostly empty. That was fine. He had a whole pack of apex predators out there now, working the night shift, completely motivated to restock his shelves. Sometimes, when the wind drops and the stove burns low, Hollis thinks back on the official reports of disappearances out his way. The frantic searches, the thermal cameras scanning the tree line, local deputies scratching their heads over heavy tracks near the highway. People are so desperate to understand the wilderness, but they're looking at it all wrong. They think the woods are full of mindless creatures lashing out at random. They don't realize there's a structure out there, an economy. So you can decide what you think about it. But if you ever drive out near the Olympic Peninsula on one of those scenic rural highways, and you decide to pull off near a trailhead for the night, if the fog rolls in thick, and you hear the heavy coordinated sounds of a pack moving through the brush right outside the truck, low growls and the awful weight of something massive hunting in the dark, don't panic too much. Chances are they aren't looking for you. You're not the target. You're not the delicacy. They're just out there doing their job, trying to find something special, trying to find something rare, just trying to pay the old man his rent. I'm really glad you stuck with this video all the way to the end. That genuinely means a lot to me. This story took a long time to put together, both the writing itself and figuring out how to show it to you visually exactly the way I pictured it. Every shot in this video was picked by hand. All the editing is fully manual work, where I thought through the scenes, the atmosphere, the sound, and the pacing, so that you wouldn't just hear a story, but actually step into it like a short film. I hope you enjoyed the ride. If the video pulled you in, support it with a like, a share, and a subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and keeps me motivated to create new stories. Any resemblance in this story is coincidental. References to real places are used purely to strengthen the atmosphere and the artistic experience. This video was created for entertainment purposes only. I'm already working on the next batch of stories, and if you have any thoughts, ideas, or requests, be sure to drop them in the comments. See you soon.